I will therefore confine myself to those issues. One is a pluralism of concerns, pluralism of interests, race, gender, class, environment, inequality, economic history, history of economic thought, economic development, economical cycles and crises, consumer behavior, behavior of the firm, and so on and so on. Now, these are domains of interest, and they can be developed from any theoretical framework. And that leads to the second issue, which is that there's more than one theoretical framework. There's neoclassical economics, which is by far the most dominant one now. That wasn't when I entered graduate school. And there's institutional economics, classical and Marxian economics, neoclassical, Keynesian and post-Keynesian approach. And I want to add one more to this list, and that is what I'm calling real economic analysis. And I'm going to try to explain what I mean by that. Then there's pluralism of politics. And here you get very large range of those who want to overthrow capitalism, those who want to develop socialism, those who want to modify capitalism, those who want to go along with it and bend it in some direction. I'm going to focus on the issue of the role of economic underlying factors, and then the role of the state, the possible effects of state intervention. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is each one of those areas of economics that I mentioned, race, gender, class, and so on, can be approached from different theoretical foundations. And here it is the difference in theoretical foundations that leads to differences in the empirical work, to differences in the interpretation of various phenomena, and to the understanding of their implications and policy. So one of the two applications of my work, and in fact the subject of my talk, is going to be the applications of what I'm calling real economic analysis to macroeconomic policy and to consumer behavior, micro and macro. I'm going to argue that the left, of which I have been a member for all my life, certainly all my working life as an economist, is very improperly enamored of what I'm going to call eclecticism. Eclecticism is the mixing of inconsistent or conflicting theoretical foundations in order to get some explanation of some particular set of phenomena. For instance, people can and consistently do deride the concept of economic man as peripheral, rational, self-centered, so on, and then deride perfect competition and rational choice in one breath, criticize all of that, and then turn to game theory, which is an application of exactly those conceptions, and turn to production possibilities curve, which is of course an expression of the efficiency and optimality of capitalism. So this, I would argue, is just simply inconsistent. Sometimes people say, well, we do it so that we get a progressive idea, but then you're not doing the theory, you're just doing the politics and reaching backward for any theory in the grab bag that'll give you the answer you already want. That's not theoretical work. The other possibility, which is more theoretical, is to add imperfections and externalities to a particular framework. This is the dominant position, not only on the left, but now also the dominant position in orthodoxy itself. It has a great advantage if you speak to the economic orthodoxy on its own terms, which is politically easier, and I must say certainly wiser in terms of your career prospects. And it certainly would have been wiser if I thought of it in terms of my career prospects. But at the same time, it inevitably ties one to the orthodoxy, because in order to have imperfections, you have to have perfection. And so you have to begin with the church before you talk about the why the reality doesn't match the church's vision of it. So it ties you, therefore, as a point of reference to the orthodoxy, and it ties you also as a point of departure, because then you interpret these events in terms of imperfect individuals, imperfect reality, and against a perfect theoretical framework, which you then modify to make this all come out right. Now, I should say that I strongly favor the pluralism of approaches, which in my department we have tried to maintain in a wide variety of frameworks for 50 years. And that includes neoclassical theory, which, by the way, we were required to do micro and macro. But we also allow you to do micro and macro from different perspectives, from alternate perspectives, such as post-Keynesian and what has long been called classical political economy. But I strongly oppose eclecticism because it is an inconsistent mixture of theoretical foundations. Consider the notion of externalities. In orthodox theory, an externality comes about because the effect of one action has a consequence for some other domain. Now, the fact that you introduce it at a late stage, I believe in one popular textbook, the externality shows up in page 223, by which point you've been totally brainwashed. Then you see the externality is something external to the theory. And when you think about that, it is surely the other way around. The fact that you have to incorporate the effects of an individual action on other people, on the environment, on other firms as an externality tells you how trapped you are in the framework. There are no externalities, there are consequences. And those consequences have to be understood due to the interaction of the units, consumers, firms, policy. And so you have to get rid of the externality. As soon as I hear the word externality, I know there is a neoclassical lurking somewhere in this otherwise progressive person. Indeed, the whole point of orthodox economics is to present a vision of capitalism, which is essentially of a perfect capitalism and hence highly, highly political, and then derive from it certain quote unquote internalities, which are efficiencies and optimalities, and then all sorts of interactions between people, between firms, between the economy and the actions of individuals are relegated to the category of externalities. And then the left often does is say, okay, that's good, because we focus on bad externalities. And I argue that it's completely inappropriate. If you buy into externalities and choose the bad ones, you're already working from the framework in which internalities are good and externalities are sometimes good and sometimes bad. This is, in my argument, completely inappropriate and theoretically a weakness. So why should we care about theory then? You know, there are many choices. You can go, it's like going to a restaurant and choosing the dish you like. I love Chinese food and I like a lot of dishes in Chinese food. So why does theory not like that? And I can choose what I like. It's because a theory has a logical structure which acts as a discipline on our ideas. Theory organizes our understanding of the world. Theories are never complete of the world. They're never complete. Rather, they force us to consider new phenomena which are related to the rest of the structure. And one of their important functions is to warn us that what we wish for in economic outcomes may not be likely, or in fact, may not even be possible. Let me give you an example. It is often argued in some parts of the left that because we struggle for higher wages are actually good for both workers and capitalists. Why for workers? Well, because they have higher wages. Why for capitalists? Because If workers have more money, they spend more money, and therefore demand rises. And if demand rises, firms expand, and therefore employment rises. And so higher wages leads not only to higher income for workers, it leads to more employment for workers as a whole. Yet, if you observe wage struggles, you find almost without exception, capitalists oppose it strongly. Minimum wage, average wage, length of the working day, they have always fought against it throughout history. And these fights have been sometimes violent, sometimes backed by the power of the state and the police power of the state, and sometimes bloody. And yet you have to ask, why do they do that? Well, because perhaps they don't understand post-Keynesian economics and don't understand that if they collectively did this, it would be good for them as a class. And then we have to also say, well, periods of successful wage struggles are sometimes succeeded by slow growth and rising unemployment. I'm going to illustrate some of those periods in my talk at the end. So we have to then understand from economic theory why the strong objection of the employers to wage increases. Why do Keynesian stimulus policies sometimes give way to stagnation and inflation, as happened in the 1970s throughout the capitalist world? And we have to look for theories that see these outcomes as intrinsic. Now, I mentioned that theories can tell you what is not likely, even though we may want it. One of the great proponents of fighting for the rights of workers was Karl Marx. Yet, if you look at the argument in Marx on what is called the Reserve Army of Labor, chapter 25, volume 1, he makes the argument that workers' wage rises, if they go far enough, can lower profitability. And if they lower profitability to the point where growth slows down, then the demand for labor slows down. It's all dynamic terms. So it's speeding up and slowing down. And if the demand for labor slows down, then you get a slowdown in employment, and then you get a pressure on the wage growth to slow down, even reverse itself. And his conclusion is that this intrinsic mechanism of capitalism leads to a persistent pool of unemployed workers, which he calls the Reserve Army of Labor. Now, this is no conservative speaking here. This is the radical, the labor radical. And he's saying to you, your theory can tell you something that you don't like, which is that the struggle for wage rises, wage increases, have consequences and limits, and we have to take that into account. I'm going to, as I said, come back to instances of just that. In modern economic theories, there are sort of three branches, three approaches. One is what I call perfectionism economics. That's neoclassical theory. Perfect consumer, perfect firms, rational choice, perfect knowledge, stochastically perfect expectations of the future, rational expectations, and so on. Somebody has their mic. Hello, somebody has their microphone on. Thank you. This is a perfectionism, optimal outcomes, capitalism is perfect. And then the logical opposition to that seems to be sensibly imperfectionism, because this perfectionism gives consequence or gives theoretical expectations which don't fit the reality. So how do we approach that? One way is to introduce imperfections into perfections. And this idea of introducing local imperfections is now the dominant wing in economic orthodoxy. So if people don't behave as a theory of consumer behavior, classical theory of consumer behavior says they should, then people are imperfect. If firms don't behave as a theory says because of oligopoly or monopoly, then firms are imperfect. If macroeconomies do not behave as a theory predicts, i.e. automatic full employment and no inflation, then they must be because of imperfections due to unions, the welfare state, and so on. This resort to particular imperfections is dominant in orthodox economics to explain actual patterns, and is adopted both by conservative economists, i.e. most famously Milton Friedman, and also by progressive economists, very progressive economists like Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman. The framework is the same, and you bring in imperfections to observe, to explain observed phenomena. But that same approach is also undertaken, is also adopted by the left. It's adopted by, say, post-Keynesian economics, whose microeconomics is based on the idea that firms have monopoly power. This is Kalecki's idea, and therefore they set a price due to their monopoly power, which is not the competitive price. And then it follows that certain consequences, prices are not flexible, they don't respond to demand, and therefore the adjustment to effective demand is not through prices, but through quantities, so therefore you get the rule of effective demand. Now, in perfect competition, firms take the prices given. That's a familiar cost curve, marginal cost, average cost, and the price as a horizontal line. And therefore, if we observe monopoly or oligopoly, if we impute monopoly and oligopoly, we then say that firms no longer take the prices given, they set prices. Well, if you approach the setting of prices from within neoclassical theory, then indeed when you observe empirically, as Kalecki does, that firms set prices, it seems eminently plausible to say that modern capitalism is characterized by imperfect competition. And if that's the case, then we need to bring in these imperfections into the theory to understand it. Now, I should say it's not just post-Keynesian theory. The dominant tradition in the Marxist analysis is the idea that modern Marxism is dominated by monopoly. And if that's the case, and we understand the outcomes of the system as a question of a balance of power between firms and monopolistic firms and workers, monopolistic capital and the state, let's say Paul Sweezy and Baran and Sweezy. And when I encounter that, as I did when I encountered Sweezy and Magdoff, I asked, well, if modern capitalism is monopoly, then what is competition that Marx talks about? And the answer is competition is small firms take the prices given. Indeed, the editors of the very famous and progressive Marxist journal called Monthly Review stated in their, when they took over from Sweezy and Magdoff, that their competition, which is the opposite of the position they hold as monopoly theorists, is that described by Milton Friedman. Now, I find this astonishing that Marx's whole work could be reduced to a second-rate neoclassical economist, at least in economics. I therefore want to move to a different framework. I want to talk about what I call real economic analysis. I'm going to talk about it generally, and then I'm going to talk about how to apply it to two domains, but I have many, many domains. The framework I'm talking about is constructed, is excavated in the archaeological and theoretical sense from Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Keynes, and Harrod. So it's not attributable to any one of them. And indeed, they can't just be added up to create a new theory. You have to find a path, a consistent path from important points they make and weave it together. And this took me an exceedingly long time. Just writing my book took 15 or 18 years, but all the work before of 2 decades solving problems so that the result is consistent. So this is the summarized in my 2016 book that Nick mentioned, Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, and Crises, which lays out the theoretical and empirical content of my framework, and my homepage, which is Anwar Shaikh econ.org, provides many applications, and my book webpage, which is realecon.org, provides lectures. It provides all the data in my book. So this is no World Bank database. You can go there and replicate every piece of data because it's already there. Spreadsheets, you can correct it and you can extend it. Now, in this framework that I'm talking about, there are no imperfections. They're realities. And the realities have to be understood theoretically, having outcomes. They're competitive realities, they're consumer realities, and we can show that they imply certain theoretical and empirical patterns. Let's say we talk about consumers, which I'm going to talk about later. Consumers are diverse. They make personal choices based on socially shaped habits, income and wealth levels, race, class, gender, ethnicity, family, personal history, and love and hatred for others. The interaction with others is crucial for determining consumer behavior. I'm sure there's nobody in this audience who has not been to a football game and has not had sides and not understood that the choice of consumer behavior you make to pay for those damn tickets has a lot to do with how you feel about what others feel. So you're not just talking about your utility and ranking, you're talking about incorporating your love for people on your side and your hostility to people on the other side. This is our basic tribal instinct. Now, markets adapt to consumer choice, yes, but consumers also adapt to market pressures, and that has to be built into any theory of consumer behavior. I'm going to show you that taking all of these elements into account, one can develop a theory of consumer behavior, of microeconomic behavior that gives you all the observed phenomena, downward sloping demand curves, income elasticities, Engel's law, which is different elasticities for necessary goods and luxury goods, and the Keynesian consumption function, all from a framework that admits and builds on the complexity of human behavior. Secondly, when you come to the theory of the firm, instead of perfect or imperfect competition, I'm going to talk about the notion of real competition. Real competition is a war. Firms actually fight for market share. In that fight, they wish to damage other firms. And by the way, Harvard Business Review is extremely clear about this if you have any doubts. And I cite many instances where they talk about crushing the opposition. So they not only care about other firms, they care about them negatively. Well, if you're going to fight for market share by lowering costs, then cost cutting is really, really important. And that means various ways to find cheaper labor, longer working hours, more intensive working days, and new technologies which are capital intensive and might display lower cost and might displace workers. Jack Ma, the dominant, one of the dominant capitalists of the world, the Chinese capitalist Jack Ma, has a famous phrase which he considers sort of the ideal working conditions, ideal, called 996, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. Now, Jack Ma doing this because he doesn't understand economics? No, it's because he does understand economics, and we don't understand that ourselves, then we don't understand economics, in my opinion. The book that I'm talking about, and I'm going to show you some pictures of it when I start my section on consumer behavior, provides a theoretical and empirical explanation of relative prices, stock and bond prices, interest rates and exchange rates, macro policy, unemployment, and effects of wages on growth, and so on. And one of the key things in this approach is the importance of profitability. Profitability regulates the behavior of the firm. Firms decide to produce because they expect to sell the product for profit. So therefore, supply is determined by expected profitability. But if they're going to produce, they have to hire workers. So the demand for labor is dependent on the expected profitability of the supply. But they have to also buy raw materials. So the demand for intermediate goods. And then they have to decide whether they want to grow. So the demand for investment goods. So here we have profitability acting on the supply and profitability acting on demand. And so demand and supply are not independent entities. They're the two sides of the profitability nexus. They don't operate in the same way for profitability, but they are derived from that same foundation. Now, in this framework, investment is driven by profitability. And investment is the growth of capital and the growth of the capitalist economy. Therefore, growth is driven by profitability. In my book, I show not only a theoretical foundation for that, I show innumerable empirical applications of these kinds of ideas. And one important one is that capital flows from one industry to another according to the rate of return on new investment. This is an important point. If you're going to make an investment, you don't look around and say, oh, I want to produce steel. Why don't I invest in 50-year-old steel plants, or maybe a bit of everything? Of course not. You want to come in with the lowest cost and generally the most capital intensive steel production, so you have an advantage in the competition for the market share. That means it's new investment, or the rate of return on new investment, which is the fundamental factor that you have to take into account. And this same variable, which is the rate of return on new investment, also drives aggregate investment, because one by one firms are regulated by their expectation profits, but their expectations are regulated by the outcomes. No, you can jump off a building because you have expectations of how you're going to go to the ground. But if you don't adjust your expectations along the way, you're going to be in for a hard surprise. All actions are regulated by the outcomes and the influence of that on your actions. The person who makes a framework for this is actually George Soros, his notion of reflexivity. And let me just illustrate that in terms of his analysis of the stock market, because it brings in this whole idea of expectations, outcomes, and processes. He says, suppose that you and a sufficient number of people think that a stock price is going to go up. Well, okay, then you're motivated to buy it. Well, you buy it, the stock price will go up. So if the stock price does go up, what should prevent you from having that positive feedback and therefore buying more stock price? And therefore stock prices are essentially based on expectations and narratives, as Bob Schiller would say. But Soros says, oh, wait a minute, there's another element here, which is what he calls fundamentals. Stock prices have certain fundamental properties, which is actually, I'm not going to show you because I have another talk, another aspect prepared, but it's in my book, that fundamentals involve the profitability of the firms which are issuing the stock. And that is not one that you can just make up through expectations. That's based on outcomes, on how much you produce, how much you sell, how much you pay. And that profitability, Soros says, regulates expectations, because stock prices are ultimately regulated by expected rates of return on the businesses that issue the stock. Then Soros says, okay, in that case, imagine that the stock price goes above the fundamentals. As that happens, the price gets further and further away from a sustainable level. And I, George Soros, want to ride it to the top and get off before it comes down. Because the greater the gap, the more people will be nervous about the sustainability of the market and they'll jump off. When that happens, the expectations also collapse because people are selling and they now, expect the price to go down. So this is what he calls reflexive theory, which is a relationship between expectations, outcomes, and fundamentals. Now, regrettably, for me anyway, Soros doesn't tell us what the fundamentals are, but I have an argument for that, and I won't be able to do it here unless you ask me the right question, but it is part of what I do in the book. If it's true that investment is regulated by profitability, then growth is regulated by profitability. And of course, investment is based on expectations, what Keynes calls them animal spirits. And these animal spirits are like Soros's expected profit price of stocks. They feed on each other and they continue to create the boom. But as even Keynes admits, these collapse as they get further away from the sustainable level, which is in fact the actual profit rate. So if you expect profit rates to go up, yeah, you invest and that creates demand and growth increases. But if the profit, your expectations are not fulfilled because the actual profit rate doesn't match it, then the expectations are themselves undermined. So none of the arguments I'm making have any foundation in rational choice. They have no foundation in perfect or imperfect behavior, nor in a list of imperfections tailored to match some actual outcomes. And that is because you cannot have an imperfection without a perfection. Now, I went to Catholic school in Pakistan, and it's a pretty obvious point to me that if you're talking about imperfections, you're talking by implicitly of perfections. So I urge you all listening to this and hearing this, please do not approach reality in terms of the imperfection of reality. It's the imperfection of the theory. And the way you get to that is not to add various imperfections, to twist and bend the theory to fit the actual outcomes. Is what I call enhanced interrogation of the theory, but rather to start from a theory where these outcomes are expected and are consistent with the theory, and doesn't mean you can predict everything or understand everything, but that the foundation is solid. I'm gonna bring back, so annoying. Sorry, my computer just intervened. As I said, my book has both theoretical and empirical analysis, and 50% of my book is empirical, by the way. And all the data, as I said, is on my book webpage, realecon.org, available to you in spreadsheets directly. So, and all the sources are there. Every line, every detail has sources, so you can check on it and modify it as you choose. I have data on production, costs, money, relative prices, stock and bond prices, exchange rates, behavior of the firm, macroeconomics of growth, wages, unemployment, profitability, inflation, business cycles, long waves, and recurrent economic depressions. And I've subsequently worked on the econophysics of national and global inequality, because that's a powerful tool to explain the actual processes. In every case, I'm trying to show how the theory can explain what actually occurs, and rather than accusing the reality, I thank the reality for enabling us to understand the underlying processes. And this is, again, a key point, which I want to come back to, is that I'm arguing for an alternate theoretical framework. I'm urging you to consider this. Consider this even as you're working on DSGE models or something of that sort, which, by the way, have a pretty absurd theoretical foundation in terms of behavior of the firm and the behavior of consumers. Give room for another alternative. And the reason is that as economists, if you understand the world in a particular way and you act on that understanding, worse yet, if you're a policymaker and your understanding is wrong, you don't pay the price. Someone else does. And that is the people who are subject to the policies and results of your understanding. Fortunately, they no longer execute advisors, as they do in medieval times, who gave the wrong advice. Nowadays, you just get tenure and write another book. So I urge you not to take policy and practice as something you can just gin up by the right approach. Now, with this in mind, I want to show you how the argument that I'm talking about can be applied to consumer behavior and then stock market behavior. And let me start with that. And I need to share my screen. Let's see. I'm not sharing my screen somewhere. Share screen. Can everybody see this? Actually, I can't tell if you can see it. Nick, can you tell me? Yeah.
Yes, okay, we can see that.
So like any good firm or seller of anything, let me start by selling my book. This is the cover of my book. That, by the way, is called Parsons Red, not Marx's Red. It's a color from my division of my university called Parsons. And the book came out in 2016 from Oxford University Press. A couple of years later, this version of the book came out, which is a Turkish translation. It was done incredibly well and very rapidly. And just a couple of months ago, this version, which is the Chinese edition, which is in 2 volumes, came out. And I'm really gratified that people are reading it. Unfortunately, a lot of time on PDF, but I guess I never expected to make money from something like this. If I had one of those websites where you could sign on and donate money, that would be another alternative, but I don't. And the Spanish edition of the book is due in the spring of 2022 from Fondo de Cultura Económica. So I want to show you that the analytical framework that we normally encounter in micro, the standard thing that when you open a micro textbook, it says you have a budget line, you have a certain income, and this income can be spent on either good X1 or good X2, depending on the price of the 2 goods, so that you get a trade-off using the income between those 2 types of good. But the modification I'm going to make is substantial because I'm not going to use any reference whatsoever to rational choice, individual behavior, optimal, utility maximizing, or any of that stuff. Let me first begin by defining 2 goods, one of which I'm going to call a necessity. And the whole point of being a necessity is it requires a minimum positive amount, a positive minimum account. The whole point of being a necessary good, like food, is that you can't just go down to 0. So that means that, technically speaking, it introduces a non-linearity into the choice frame. Then that implies that the budget constraint of an individual is segmented into a feasible space, which is between the minimum which you have to have of a necessary good and the maximum that you can have of the necessary good, which depends on your income, money income, divided by the price of the necessary good. That tells you how many necessary goods you could buy at maximum. The feasible space is between the minimum and the maximum. Obviously, if that's the case, then the other good, which I call a luxury good, must also have a set of limits, because you cannot buy luxury goods except with the income above the amount necessary for the minimum income. And I call that amount above the minimum expenditures on the necessary good discretionary income. That's actually a terminology from Keynesian economics and from practical work on economic analysis. Now, I'm going to have only 3 equations, and they're all definitional. The first one is the income constraint, which is income is Y. P1 is the price of the first good. X1 is the quantity of the first good, which is a necessary good. And P2 is the price of the second good, which is a luxury good. And X2 is the quantity. So your income must be spent on the first good or the second. Now, you can include in the luxury goods savings so that this becomes an identity. The sum of your expenditures is consumption goods and savings. The maximum amount of the necessary good I can buy is the income divided by the price of the necessary good. That's a maximum quantity. And then the maximum amount of the luxury good is the income of money income divided by the price of the luxury good, which gives you a quantity of the luxury good, minus the equivalent of the luxury good, which you must, whose income or whose expenditure you must reserve instead for the minimum for the necessary consumption expenditure. So this is very straightforward. And nope, that doesn't work. So this is what I just said in terms of a familiar budget line. Horizontal axis, the necessary goods. The maximum necessary good is your income divided by the price of necessary good. The minimum is a fixed minimum here, just to be a simplifying framework. And the maximum luxury good is not up there because you cannot spend more than the amount left over from your minimum. So you have a feasible range for the luxury good. And let's say you're at some point A. That means that you're consuming a certain amount of X2, which is a luxury good, and a certain amount of X1. And you can define point A in a variety of ways. And I'm going to show you that I'd like to define it in a simple and very useful way. Now, the key point I want to make is individuals will vary from one to another in many attributes, not just income, but class, race, gender, and even whimsical behavior. You don't have to consume the same thing every day. I never do. I consume as I feel within the limits of my income. So all we need to say is that the collectivity of individuals will choose some bundle within the feasible range. The bundle will be this point A, and this is the outcome. They will choose one certain quantity, collective quantity of X2 and a collective quantity of X1, and that'll give you a point on that curve. Nothing says that this statistical average consumer is behaving in the standard way. On the contrary, the standard way is a fiction. Average consumers behave according to many, many influences, including the influences of culture and race and gender and ethnicity, as well as the advertising and nationality and so on. And we can accommodate that because all we need to say is that the collectivity has a stable consumption propensity in the aggregate. Now, of course, if things change underneath, if there's a war or if there's a crisis, then all of that will change. So you don't want this propensity to consume to be independent of social events, but stochastically with the normal changes going on, some people move here, some people move there. It's quite remarkable, actually, how the averages are stable. And this pi, which is what I want to define, is the average discretionary propensity to consume. It's a consumption of the ratio of the necessary good to the total amount of money you have to spend on the good which is over and above what you have to spend for minimum. So interestingly enough, this makes it very similar to the Keynesian marginal propensity to consume out of discretionary income, which, by the way, some Keynesians use as the basis for the consumption function. I'm going to argue, and I do argue in the book, that this framework, this set of outcomes can be derived from a large number of different micro frameworks. For instance, in the book, which I can talk about more at the end, we can assume that all individuals are neoclassical, perfectly rational, and exactly alike consumers. It's a standard case of microeconomic behavior in which the aggregate is just a representative agent and therefore has to be identical to the individuals. But we can also derive this aggregate behavior from individuals who are neoclassical, optimizing, but not alike, in which case we know there's no representative agent, but I will show you that in the model of it, it comes up with the same results. I can also derive the same aggregate behavior from Gary Becker's notion of a stochastic individual, in which the person chooses randomly every day from their budget set. And because they choose randomly, there's an aggregate propensity to consume, which is a reflection of the random selection process. And then I also in the book show that you can derive the same outcomes that I'm talking about here from behavior which involves individuals acting in response to each other. This is a model that we developed from the work of Giovanni Dolci in Pisa. And what we say is that the two sets of individuals whose behavior is modified by those around them. And let's think of these as young people who adapt to what other people are doing. And then people whose behavior is not modified by around them. These are older curmudgeon-y people like myself whose clothing hasn't changed in 50 years. And so that second set is another part of your total set of individuals. And by simulating all of these using net logo, by the way, you can show that they come to the same result. They come to an average propensity to consume, which reflects all these different outcomes. And therefore, you can get downward sloping demand curves. So the downward sloping demand curves can be derived by just taking the equations that I've talked about before, propensity to consume, which is your discretionary income divided by your actual consumption of X1 divided by the discretionary income in X1. And I can derive, therefore, the demand from the identities before, the demand for X1 and demand for X2. In the interest of time, I'm going to speed through it, but it's a very simple algebraic translation. And you notice in each case in the demand, you have, in the demand for X1, you have P1, which is the price of X1. And you can see if the price of X1 goes up, the quantity of X1, the demand for X1 will go down. If the price of P2 goes up, the quantity of X2 goes up. And the quantity of X2 depends also on the price of X1. So there are cross elasticities, which are again familiar in microeconomics. But now I've derived downward sloping demand curves without any reference to rational choice, perfect knowledge, or imperfect knowledge. None of that, saying consumers don't care about other people. Everything that people actually do can be incorporated in such a framework, because all we require is that the complex of interactions produces a stable outcome. This is actually well known in physics. The physicist Robert Laughlin talks about this as the supreme indifference of aggregate results to the micro foundations, because many different ones give you the same result. And we think of that now as emergent properties. Okay, so I can derive also from the same framework, which is in the book, that the income elasticity of necessary goods is less than 1, because you have a minimum amount of necessary goods you have to purchase, while the income elasticity of luxury goods is greater than 1. This is the best known empirical law in micro behavior and consumer behavior. It is that the income elasticity of necessary goods is less than 1, income elasticity of luxury goods is greater than 1. It's called Engels' law of consumer demand. And no, it's not that Engels, it's another Engels. And I derive these directly from the identities and definitions and the assumption of a stable marginal propensity to consume. Now, if I change the terminology and I say, okay, let me call the necessary good consumption good, and the luxury good I call savings, financial assets, then I have a relation between consumption and savings. And that is, of course, the Keynesian budget line. And I can derive the same algebraic relationship that I derive for individual consumer behavior, and it becomes the Keynesian consumption function, identically the Keynesian consumption function, where it's a consumption function, the marginal propensity to consume out of discretionary income, and the consumption function depends on the amount of discretionary income you have. And this, by the way, is a pretty standard representation of consumption. So to end with this part, all the preceding results are derived by shaping structures such as the budget constraint and the minimum level of consumption, and a stable aggregate propensity to consume. Individuals can behave in very complicated way, responding to each other, to stimuli, to market stimuli, to social cultural ones. But at the aggregate level, the corresponding stable patterns, which, by the way, we observe, are emergent properties. Okay, let me take a breath and let me now switch to the question of real effective demand. Nick, how am I running on time?
Perhaps about 10 minutes more, and then we could get into the Q&A. That's all right.
Okay,
with
good,
you?
good. I have time, yes. And share the screen again. Okay. I now want to switch to macro. And I want to show you how the same framework, indeed with even the same variables that I talked about at the micro level, manifests itself in the regulation of aggregate demand and growth. So the first theme is that all the equilibrium, all the processes I talk about in the book are dynamic and turbulent. There's no state of equilibrium. There's always fluctuation around moving centers of gravity. So there's no static framework. Consumer micro, as we saw, is based on heterogeneous agents acting in a socially acculturated manner. And aggregate effective demand is then also grounded in real competition because aggregate investment is motivated by the net rate of return on investment, the net expected rate of return, which is the expected rate of return minus the interest rate. Now notice this is exactly the same as Keynes's idea of the marginal efficiency of capital and the difference between it and the interest rate. The expected rate of return is regulated in the sense of George Soros by the actual rate. So we expect a turbulent series of processes. And notice that everything here in a growing framework. I'm not talking about static economics. I'm talking about dynamics in the sense that Harrod emphasized. Now, neoclassical economics is supply side because it claims that in the short run, the level of output is determined by profit maximizing utilization of the capital stock and the full employment of the stock of labor. Then if the labor supply is growing over the long run, output and capital will adapt to the growth rate of labor because the system brings about full employment. So therefore, the growth rate of labor becomes the regulating variable. Keynesian macroeconomics comes along and says, no, this is all wrong. Real macroeconomics is demand side, because in the short run, the level of output is regulated by relatively autonomous components of aggregate demand, autonomous consumption, autonomous investment, the first things you encounter in any macro textbook. Then it follows that output growth derives from the growth of autonomous demand. And here it's very important that autonomous demand can include demand from the state, because then the state can become the regulator. Investment demand is going up and down. Consumption demand depends on employment and propensities to consume, but the state can come in and fill in the gaps or reduce the excesses, and therefore the state becomes a central regulator of capitalism. I've already argued that classical real macroeconomics is neither supply side nor demand side. It is profit side. Profit operates on both demand and supply for the reasons I mentioned before. Firms produce with the expectation of profit. And by the way, as we found out with COVID, if those expectations are wrong, they pull back and even shut down. If they're going to continue producing, then they have to have raw materials, labor, and machinery. And therefore, the expectation of profitability not only regulates how much they produce, it regulates the demand for labor, demand for raw materials, and demand for investment goods. Now, this is not a simple translation, but you can see that if you know inputs and outputs, you can connect these two up. So let me now jump to the key point, which is in this framework, what happens if you have a fiscal stimulus? I have lots of data in the book, but I'm running short in time, so I'm just going to tell you the big story. A fiscal stimulus can pump up the economy. We know that. We can see it. We can observe it. For instance, in World War II or in the Great Depression, it can pump up the economy, and therefore it can increase employment and lower unemployment. Now, if there's a lot of excess labor, as in the Great Depression, then this will pick up that excess labor and tighten the labor market, but that doesn't necessarily mean it raises wages because there's a stock of available labor. But as the labor market tightens under non-war or depression circumstances, then wages, if wages rise and they rise faster than productivity, in other words, the wage share rises, then the profit share, which is the dual of the wage share, falls, and therefore the profit rate, which depends on the profit share, will fall relative to its trend. It's an important qualification because the profit rate may be rising, then it'll slow down, or it may be falling and may fall faster. I have lots of data in the book about the patterns in the US economy. If the profit rate slows down, then the normal growth rate slows down. And unless there's something done to offset that slowdown, you'll induce a slower growth and will then give an incentive to increase the employment of machinery, to increase the length and intensity of the working day, to put pressure on wages, to move capital to where there are cheaper goods, and so on, and to import labor. Because as the labor market tightens, all of these mechanisms counter that. Now, this is not my idea. This is actually the idea in Marx on the reserve army of labor. And it's the formalized by Richard Goodwin, your famous Cambridge economist, Richard Goodwin, who formalized the argument in Marx in terms of the famous nonlinear predator-prey model. It's a beautiful model, and you really should look at it. I make use of it in my book, and I also show empirical applications of it. So if this is true, the key thing to worry about is where wage increases lead to wage share increases, which means wages are rising faster than productivity, and the growth rate slows down. Let me then talk about Brazil under Lula. I often talk about instead the US economy and Germany in the Great Depression and then in World War I, but I can come back to that. I want to apply the Lula thing because it's less familiar to people. The first and second Lula governments from 2003 to 2010 focused on the wonderful, important expansion of mass consumption by providing additional income to previously excluded families by increasing public and private investment in infrastructure. Fiscal policy was used to fund social structures, increase minimum wages, increased housing, infrastructure, health, and education expenditures. All wonderful and signaling a new new stage in Brazilian economics. Credit was used to expand finance so that borrowing by firms and by private investors could increase expenditures, and spending was subsidized also at low interest rates. So this gives big incentive for credit boom. And this absolutely worked. Poverty fell, income inequality was reduced, unemployment fell, and growth averaged a robust 4%. And yet, even after the global crisis of 2008, the government was able to induce a fairly fast recovery by expanding public investment and credit policies while maintaining social programs. But after 2010, productivity slowed down, the wage share rose, and the measured profit rate fell. I cite where the data is from Calvaro and Rugitsky. And over the next 3 years, from 2011 to 2014, the growth rate fell by half to 2.4. And in 2015, it went sharply negative. At the same time, the real exchange rate depreciated by 45% in the face of this crisis in import regulations. And there's a whole connection between growth rates and exchange rates I can talk about. So to come back and end, I'm trying to argue in favor of a framework which is general, which is empirically grounded, which has a different theoretical structure, and can give you an understanding of outcomes, even if those outcomes are ones that you don't like. I didn't like what happened in Brazil. I devoutly wished that it didn't happen. But we need to understand why so that we can talk about how to do it differently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shaikh, for that incredibly wide-ranging presentation. We have a lot of questions, so I'll just touch on the major themes and get your reactions. So first, as you can imagine, we have a lot of questions on how does your particular conception of real economic analysis and placing profit-driven growth at the center rather than demand or supply side analysis, what are the kind of implications in the immediate term for policy, particularly as it pertains to the challenges that we face, climate and COVID? It's a very wide-ranging question, so any thoughts you have there would be appreciated.
Okay, thank you. I lost the screen, so I always have trouble with, well, never mind. I wanted to see the whole screen, but I'm not seeing it. So climate, COVID, and let me start here with the climate. I argue in the book that we should pity the poor capitalists. We should pity them because they're driven by the pressure from other capitalists to cut costs or die. And death is a real thing with firms. 50% of the firms in the United States go out of business in 6 years in good times. So they face a strong pressure, a Darwinian pressure. And that means that they have to use every means at their disposal to maintain low costs and profitability. And of course, despoiling the environment is a wonderful mean from their point of view because it lowers their costs and keeps them into operation. I live in Brooklyn, where there's something called the Gowanus Canal. Gowanus Canal used to be so black from all the things that flown into it. And by the way, the mafia apparently also disposed a few other things into it, that if you fell in, it would corrode. And they've taken a long time to clean it up. But what was the main source of the black? It was the pollution dumped by firms into that canal. So it became literally toxic and dangerous. But this is a necessity imposed on firms unless there's a way to prevent them from doing that for all of them. So there's no unfair cost. And firms typically object to limitations because it doesn't fall equally. It's impossible, in fact. If you do it in the US, it doesn't fall on China, and it doesn't fall on Europe to the same degree. The climate outcome that we have now is the result of the power of capitalism. The power of capitalism to scourge, to scour the earth for resources, for labor, for produce increasing amounts of output, and of course producing toxins and pollutants in the process. People sometimes talk about this as if it is due to humans. That's a nasty lie, and as a human, I really object to that. It is due to the capitalist incentive, the same thing that gave us the wealth, gave us the pollution. That means if you're going to stop it, you can't just stop it by asking people to eat less or use less plastic bags. You have to intervene to stop it at the source. And that means you have to talk also about how capital is forced to do differently. And if you do that, you run into the problem that capital can move. US to Mexico. It can move from US to China. It does, in fact, move to these. So it is quite hard to pin down, but you can still do it. The history of capitalism is that social intervention does have an effect. That's how we get higher wages. That's how we get unemployment insurance. That's how we get act against discrimination. So the same thing has to be understood. But be understood that this is not in the interests of capitalists. And don't be shocked if they try to evade it and block it in some way. Now, COVID is an interesting example of the profitability thing again. One could argue that the conditions which led to the transfer of COVID are actually one of the great advances of capitalism. You can go from anywhere in the world to the next place in the world shortly, pick up a plane and go. Well, in that case, you can also transmit a virus incredibly fast in a very difficult way to track. And so the existence of the virus is only part of the story. The other part is the fact of the transmissibility, and that is the strength of capitalism also, but also the weakness. Now, what did COVID do? COVID meant that people could work from home, and many people lost their jobs, by the way. They're not all petty bourgeois like us and sit at their computer and earn a living. They lost their jobs. As they lost their jobs, and as they worked from home and didn't spend money in the same way, demand dropped. And demand dropped as an autonomous drop. The people may have had the money, they didn't spend it. Firms had to cut back because their profitability fell. One of the ways to counter that is for the state to inject demand. And this is a Keynesian solution. And that works perfectly well in this kind of situation. But it doesn't follow that that works when the economy recovers and when it's growing and where the pool of unemployed is shrinking, because then it has a different consequence. And that consequence can lead to the negative outcomes I talked about. I've argued in the book that what we call stagflation, which is the period of the 70s, was exactly a period where Keynesian stimulation policies led to a rise in the wage share, and I can measure this, a fall in the profit rate, a slowdown in growth, and therefore the more you stimulated, the less you got a growth benefit and the more you got inflation. And that was called stagflation. That can be understood theoretically and empirically. Okay.
Thank you very much for that. You finished there by touching on some Keynesian policies and perhaps their limitations. We've received quite a few questions from some post-Keynesians or people that are sympathetic to the post-Keynesian perspective. And they were just wondering, what are the strengths you see in that particular approach? You identify that when it's just thought of as imperfections, it is incomplete, because then it's measured relative to perfection, which reality is not. So what would some of the strengths that you see in post-Keynesian theory be?
Let me, give me a second. I'm writing this down. So let me answer in an elliptical way, because I want to raise the question in a broader context. When Hitler came to power, he expanded the German economy so much that this massive unemployment, which was a source of his ability to stir up the population and turn it against the existing social democratic government, he was able to eliminate it in 1 year. Kaletsky calls this policy of Hitler military Keynesianism. Now, in World War II, almost every capitalist country did the same thing. They greatly expanded government spending, running deficits, and there was no inflation. There was no slowdown in growth. Rather, unemployment fell dramatically, and the economy boomed, making terrible weapons, but it boomed. And yet, when the same policies of stimulus of effective demand were applied in World War II, after World War II, when markets were allowed to operate freely again, we got increasing inflation and decreasing growth rate, stagflation. So what's the difference? I argue that one major difference is that in the military Keynesianism of Hitler and in the military Keynesianism of World War II in every capitalist country, it wasn't just a stimulus of the economy, it was also the suppression of market feedback effects. You were not allowed to raise prices just because demand was rising, even if you have bottlenecks. And believe me, Hitler had a rather strong view on people who did that. But even in the US, raising prices was called war profiteering and was punishable. You were not allowed to fight for higher wages because that too was taking advantage of the war effort and damaging the soldiers. You were not allowed to operate at the same rate. You were asked to operate faster and faster and work longer hours in the war effort. And so productivity rose, wages rose much more slowly than productivity, and you got a declining wage share. Also, prices were not allowed to rise because they were by fiat constrained, and interest rates were held down at the bottom. So here you have severed the link between a stimulus and market reaction when you have high high employment, low unemployment. After World War II, it seemed as if these policies were perfect. They worked so well that we should apply them. But now the difference is the market was allowed to have inflation if supply was tight. Wages were allowed to rise if the labor market was tight. Interest rates were allowed to rise if prices were rising. And so in that context, you allowed the negative feedback that I talked about before on profitability and hence on slowdown of growth to come into play. And I show in the book empirically also that this is where the post-Keynesians don't have the feedback loop because they take profits as something firms select. And I'm arguing in the classical framework, profit is something the firms get, depending on the wage share. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No, that's great. One particular element that was identified in questions is the role of monetary analysis and money supply in your theory. How does your real economics think about that, given we're amidst debates of, for example, raising interest rates and reducing the money supply in reaction to the inflation that we're seeing post-pandemic?
Great, thank you. Those are great questions. So let me start with the interest rate thing. We know that monetary policy has driven the interest rates down by buying bonds, raising the price of bonds, has driven them down in a way never before seen in capitalism, except in wartime efforts where they were pushed down and kept there. And that has a very important theoretical implication from my point of view, and indeed Keynes's point of view, which is that investment is driven by the difference between the rate of return on investment and the interest rate. Because the rate of return on investment is what you get for throwing your money, as Marx puts it, into the competitive pool. And the interest rate is your benchmark of whether you're getting at least what you could have gotten if you didn't take this risk. So the difference between the rate of return on investment and the interest rate, and I measured that in the book, is a measure of the vitality of investment. And Keynes makes the same point. He calls the difference between the marginal efficiency of investment and the interest rate the vital driver of investment. Well, investment is a driver of growth. So you can manipulate growth by lowering the interest rate. And I show in the book that this is a major feature of the neoliberal era beginning in 1980s. Reagan in the US, Thatcher in England, stimulating capitalism by suppressing wages, attacking unions, but also by lowering the interest rate, freeing up controls on capital. All of these allow profitability to change its direction and create, in fact, a boom. They create an increase in growth and a revitalizing of the system. Now, the second aspect of money, how does that relate to inflation? In post-Keynesian theory, inflation comes about when the economy approaches a limit. And the limit in this case is full employment. That's certainly in Keynes, in the full employment limit. The trouble is that didn't work empirically in the 70s because unemployment kept rising and you get inflation rising also. Well, neoclassical theory has a variety of different explanations of inflation, but again, they boil down to the idea that when the system approaches a certain limit, which is the availability of labor subject to technical change and expectations, that process will lead to inflation. I argue that there's an interesting alternate notion of limit, which was earlier and older, which is actually in Ricardo and Marx, and shows up later in John von Neumann's work on growth paths. And just to put it very simply, in Ricardo's corn model, you take some seed and you put it in the ground. So you use some of the corn as seed. You use some of the corn to feed workers. So now you have inputs and labor. You use that process to produce more corn. So you end up with more corn than you put in. The difference between the two is a surplus product in the sense of all the classical economists, including Ricardo. And the maximum growth rate you have is to reinvest when you put all the surplus product back in. In other words, you don't use it for capitalist consumption, you don't use it to fund the state, you put it all back in. Of course, that's an abstract and impossible limit, but that tells us something important, because that surplus product relative to the inputs is the profit rate. The value of the surplus divided by the value of the inputs is the profit rate. And so you have another idea, which the maximum growth rate of the economy is the profit rate. This is actually the formal result in John von Neumann's mathematical model. And that led me to think about, how do we know when an economy is approaching its limit? I don't believe labor is a constraint. I think labor can be imported. Labor can be displaced by productivity change, technical change, and so on. We know this empirically. So the imminent limit comes from profitability. And that means that in my empirical work, I take the ratio of the actual growth rate to the profit rate. And that is the index of the tightness of the economy, because the profit rate is a maximum growth rate. So the ratio of the actual to the maximum is the what I call the growth limit or growth tightness of the economy. And I show that you can explain inflation this way extremely well, even when the Phillips curve falls apart, even when other explanations fall apart. This works because it's, again, intrinsic to the growth process. And we also show that it works in many different countries, in data across the developing world, in data across Latin America, and of course, in the US in different time periods. So I would argue that you do need a theory of inflation, and this is where money comes in, because pumping money into the economy pumps up demand. The question is, what's the limit to supply? And the limit to supply here is, perhaps not surprisingly, profitability.
Yeah, that's brilliant. At the moment, there are so many debates saying we have no theory of inflation because the Phillips curve and money multiplier model seems to be falling apart. That seems like an incredibly generative approach to take.
If I may say one more thing, in my book, I show exactly why the Phillips curve falls apart. I mean, I show its shift, and I show that from my framework, I can expect where that Phillips relation will hold and where it shifts and why it shifts from specific factors having to do with effective demand and profitability. So I have all that data and all those lovely graphs in the chapter on inflation.
Another reason to buy the book, although there have been
exactly.
so many presented already today. Just one very final question before we end up for this evening. Many like me and other people like me are students who are going through a mainstream degree, which has limited or no exposure to heterodox approaches. So what is your advice to people like us in either extracting some value from the mainstream degree and neoclassical economics, or in terms of exploring alternative approaches ourselves or working with other disciplines?
Thank you. That's a good question. And my first answer is organize. Organize, organize, organize. You don't fight against something individually. And your organization, and there are many, many across the globe now, are exploring these same possibilities. So that would be the first thing. And that means you should contact each other. You should argue and debate. I come from the late 60s, early 70s time when we had strikes all over the world, in Colombia, in Paris, in Mexico City, and many other places, against the conditions of our times, but also against the theory of these conditions. And it's from that beginning that post-Keynesian economics emerges, as well as classical Marxian and what I'm calling real economic analysis. But then you also have to organize study groups. Now, if you want to study something and you do it individually, then you're doomed, because you don't have the benefit of the debate. I started by talking about pluralism, right? And pluralism requires a pluralism of responses also in understandings. So study what you need to study: post-Keynesian economics, neoclassical economics, hopefully real economic analysis, and compare and contrast them. argue, fight it out, because there's no other way that I know of to gain knowledge except through engagement. And the last is the world has to be changed. If it's not changed, we won't be having this discussion in the next 50 years. And so your responsibility is not only to help change outcomes, but to change the understanding of what happens if you intervene. And this is a very important task. You have to judge theories also by the history and their record. No theory is perfect. No theory will be absent of mistakes, but theories are different and they tell you different warnings. They give you different warnings and you have to keep those in mind. So if you can have a curriculum that includes my kind of argument, not just post-Keynesian and neoclassical, then in my opinion, you will benefit.
Brilliant. And with that call to arms to organize, debate, and intervene, I think that's a brilliant place to end for this evening. Once again, I'd like to thank Professor Shaikh sincerely again for such a wide-ranging talk and his generosity of time in responding to questions. As I've said before, if you want to watch anything again or share this with any others, there'll be a recording that is distributed via our mailing list and uploaded to YouTube. So feel free to share that around once it's available. Before we end up for today, a quick shout out for next week's events with the filmmaker Mary Filippo, who will be talking about her new film, My Miseducation, a filmmaker's journey through the mind-boggling constructs of mainstream economics, which interviews, I know it's a, how can you not want to go to that?
I need to see that film. Send me the link. I would definitely
completely. We definitely will. So that'll be on the 27th on next Wednesday. Please do come along to that. Once again, Professor Shaikh, thank you so much for your time. And we hope to have you here perhaps one day in person once that is available again.
Yeah, you owe me a drink.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
good night to everybody.
Good night. Bye-bye.